This is Garis book readings of my 2 published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 2, entitled The Author and His Work, from my book The Artilect War, Cosmists versus Terrans, a bitter controversy concerning whether humanity should build godlike, massively intelligent machines. The Author and His Work, Chapter 2. Who is this Garis who makes such outrageous claims that machines will become trillions of times smarter than human beings by the end of the century? That there will be a major war over the issue of species dominance, and that as a result billions of human beings will die. Is he a madman? Is he a science fiction writer? Does he deserve to be listened to, or can humanity afford simply to ignore him? In an attempt to establish the credibility of the author and his ideas, this chapter will be divided into 3 main sections. The first gives a brief autobiography. The second is a longer description of his current work. And the third is a presentation of his future work goals and dreams. 2.1. Autobiography. Switching to first person. I was born in Sydney, Australia in 1947, making me a middle-aged man at the time of writing, ad-libbing, which was 1998 when I wrote this first book. I've been divorced, having had 2 children by my first wife. I remarried and was then widowed. By temperament, I am a passionate intellectual with over 6,000 books in my private library. Ad-libbing, it climbed to 12,500 paper books, and then I gave most of them away to the public library in the city I live in. But I now have, maybe 50,000 electronic books and papers, so I've shifted totally to electronic pretty well. I'm a scientist, a research professor, a social activist, a writer, and a social critic. As an adolescent growing up in Australia, I felt that my passionate intellectual values were not valued by Australia's phlegmatic, anti-intellectual, brawn-based culture. During the time of the Sydney Olympic Games, a BBC journalist said of Australians that they would rather win a gold medal than a Nobel Prize. By the time I was 23 and had finished my basic undergraduate degrees in applied mathematics and theoretical physics, I wanted to leave the country forever. The first day in London, I felt overwhelmed by the feeling that I had set foot in an unquestionably more compatible and sophisticated culture. That night on BBC TV, watching a debate, I was struck by its intellectual quality. I felt a great weight lift off my shoulders. I had found my home, a culture that valued my values. After arriving in the UK and spending a year in London, with its awful air pollution in the early 1970s, I had constant catarrh and decided to move to beautiful and academic Cambridge. I became a freelance mathematics tutor to the undergraduates of some half-dozen Cambridge University colleges. The students would come in pairs to my apartment and be helped with the problems they were having with the math questions given to them by their lecturers. After a few years in Cambridge, I was browsing a world atlas that I had bought for my first wife, an Australian, whom I had met on the 5-week boat trip from Australia to England. The idea occurred to me that I could live in a cosmopolitan city like Brussels and hence benefit from the intellectual stimulus of several sophisticated cultures. All I'd need to do would be to learn a few languages and then move there. Despite the prospect of living the cosmopolitan life in the future, I loved the 4 years that I lived in Cambridge, with its green, its beauty, its academic traditions, and especially its intellectuality. It was one of the happiest periods of my life, but eventually I had to move because there were no long-term employment opportunities there for me. So I moved to Brussels. I became fluent in French, German and Dutch, as planned, and absorb those cultures into my personality, making me a much richer person, a that is, a multilingual, multicultural person, as distinct from a monolingual, monocultured person. As a multi, I found the company of other multis far more stimulating than that of monos. I loved my new life in Brussels. Unfortunately, my Australian wife did not. She longed to get back to her native cultural and linguistic roots in Australia. She pined. This conflict of interests eventually broke us up. She took the kids and settled back into Australia. After the breakup, I lived with and later married a French-speaking Belgian woman. Not surprisingly, my spoken French improved rapidly. I got a job at a large Dutch electronics/computer firm, but became increasingly frustrated and bored. I missed the intellectual life of Cambridge with its academic lifestyle. After working for a few years in the computer industry, I began a PhD in artificial intelligence and artificial life at the University of Brussels and became a researcher. Early in 1992, my second wife and I left Europe to live in Japan. I was offered a postdoc fellowship to do AI in Tsukuba's Science City. I believed at the time that by the year 2000, Japan would be the world's dominant economic power, overtaking the US. It was not to happen. I spent 8 years in Japan, working towards building the world's first artificial brain. Japan was too feudal, too fascist, too repressive of individualism, too intellectually sterile, too socially backward for me to tolerate it for very long. I stayed as long as I did, because at least Japan was paying for the construction of a remarkable new type of computer that I'll discuss further in the next section. I got a new job doing the same kind of work at a research lab in Brussels. I returned alone because my second wife had by then died of lung cancer. She had smoked heavily until I met her, stopping at my insistence, but I suppose the damage had already been done. The Brussels lab, privately owned, bought one of my brain-building machines, one of 4 in the world, at a price of $500,000 each. The lab was founded during the dot-com boom, so I decided to invest $100,000 of my Japanese savings into it, hoping to become a millionaire. My brain-building work and my machine attracted worldwide media attention. I was getting 2 international media contacts a week. France's elite newspaper, Le Monde, wrote a dozen articles on the Artilect issue and attracted enough attention to generate a political Senate hearing. France was the first country in the world to address Cosmism at the political level. Paris, July 2001. It looked as though life was going swimmingly until disaster struck. The dot-com boom turned into the dot-com crash. Investors stopped investing their money in high-tech blue sky research labs, and I lost my $100,000 when the lab went bankrupt, as well as my job. My next job was as a professor of computer science in the US. Ironically, my first working day in America happened to be on September the 11th, 2001. My head of department met me that morning at the university hotel, saying, "Hi Hugo, have you seen this?" Pointing to a TV set. Odd behavior, I thought, but looked politely in the direction he indicated. I saw a building on fire and then recognized it as New York's World Trade Center, and the penny dropped. Sometime later, in the university's cafeteria, eating breakfast, we heard a student scream out, "They hit the other one!" Is America always like this? I thought. I then had to adapt to the individualism and laissez-faire attitude of the US as a professor, adjusting to the needs of teaching students, fighting like crazy to get research grants, and adapting to my 6th country. It all took a lot of nervous energy, so I did not push my Cosmist ideas in the US media. A few years later, I gave a talk to some retirees on the Artilect debate. When I finished, I was approached by a publisher who asked me, "Have you considered writing a book on your ideas?" The answer to that question lies literally in your hands, dear reader. 2.2. My work. In this section, I will describe at some length the work that I have done over the years, with emphasis on what I have been doing during the past decade, since it is the most relevant to the theme of this book. Starting in the late 1980s, I began to evolve neural networks using a form of software simulated Darwinism called genetic algorithms, or GAs. I began publishing a steady stream of scientific research articles. I had 20 published by the time I had finished my PhD. A neural network can be envisaged as a 3D array of brain cells, neurons, interconnected by branch-like fibers called axons and dendrites. In an axon, a signal originating from a neuron travels away from it. In a dendrite, the signal is sent to the neuron. When an axon connects with a dendrite or another neuron, the junction is called a synapse. In a real biological brain, each neuron or brain cell can have tens of thousands of synapses. That is, it can be influenced by signals arriving from tens of thousands of other neurons. Those neural signals arriving at the neuron at the same time get reinforced or weighted and then summed. If the total signal strength is above the threshold firing value of the neuron, it will fire. That is, it will send pulses of electricity down its axon at a frequency proportional to how much greater the summed value is above its threshold value. The axon pulses then travel down to their synapses to influence further neurons. This kind of biological neural network can be simulated in software. Typically, the number of neurons simulated in a single network in the 80s and 90s was tens to hundreds. For my PhD work, I was using at most 16 neurons per network. This contrasts so sharply to my present work, which deals with nearly 100 million artificial neurons. The next few pages describe the work I do in more detail and are somewhat technical. I ask you to bear with me if you find their understanding somewhat difficult. If you don't understand them, skipping this section will not unduly disturb the general flow of the book. Consider also that this book contains an extensive glossary that may prove helpful from time to time with unfamiliar terms. A genetic algorithm, GA, uses a software-simulated form of Darwinian evolution to optimize the performance of whatever is being evolved. For example, take my application of GAs to the evolution of neural networks. I simulated the behavior of a neural net in the following way. The first problem was how to represent the neural net itself. I took 16 neurons and had them all connect to themselves and all other neurons, so that there is a total of 16 by 16, that's 256 connections. The incoming signal strengths, represented by ordinary decimal pointed numbers, for example 10.47, were multiplied by a weighting factor, for example 0.537, and then summed. As an illustration of this idea, imagine a very simple network of only 2 neurons, hence 4 connections. Neuron 1 sends a signal to itself at connection or synapse C11, and to neuron 2 at connection or synapse C12. Neuron 2 sends a signal to itself at connection or synapse C22, and to neuron 1 at connection or synapse C21. Assume that the signal strengths at a given moment are S1 and S2, for example 10.54 and 7.48. Each connection Cij, or synapse, possesses a corresponding weighting factor Wij, that is used to multiply the signal strength of the signal coming through the synapse. So the sum of the signal strength arriving at neuron 2 would be W12 times S1 plus W22 times S2. Similarly for neuron 1. There will be 4 of these weights. Assume that the value of each weight lies between -1 and +1. Thus each weight can be represented as a fractional binary number with, say, 8 bits, binary digits, zeros or ones. 4 such numbers can be represented by 4 by 8, that's 32 bits, that can be laid out in a row of length 32 bits. With 16 neurons, I had a row, or bit string as it's called, of 16 by 16 by 8 equals 2048 bits to represent the 16 by 16 weights of my neural network that I was evolving. If I knew the 2048-bit values, zeros or ones, I could calculate all the 256 weight values, and hence construct a fully interconnected neural net from them. The reverse process was also possible. If one knew the values of all the weights and the values of the initial incoming signals from outside the net, one could calculate the signal strength of each neuron as it fired. If one knew how each neuron fired, one knew how the whole neural network fired or behaved. One could extract the signals from some of the neurons and use them as control signals to control some process, for example, the angles of legs of a robot to make it walk. To explain how to use a GA in this application, imagine generating 100 random bit strings of length 2048 bits each. From each bit string, one can construct its corresponding neural net. To each net, one applies the same initiating input signals to kickstart the signaling of the network. One extracts the output signals and uses them, for example, to make some stick legs walk by controlling the angles of the 4 lines that make up the stick legs. One then measures how far the legs walk in a given time. Those bit strings that generate neural nets that generate a longer walking distance survive into the next generation. Those that generate a shorter distance walking are killed off, Darwinian style, that is, survival of the fittest. The fitter bit strings, that is, those with higher performance scores or fitnesses, have copies made of them, called their children or offspring. The children and their parents are then mutated, meaning that at low probability each bit may be flipped, a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 0. 2 bit strings can be sexed, a process called crossover. There are various ways to do this. One simple way is to take 2 parent bit strings, or chromosomes as they're usually called, to cut them both at the same position and then swap components. This is the equivalent of sex, which is basically only the mixing of genes from 2 parents to form the offspring. The fitter parents have more offspring. Each generation of the GA has a fixed population size, for example 100. Most mutations and crossovers cause the chromosomes to have lower fitnesses, so they get weeded out of the population. Occasionally, a mutation or crossover actually improves the fitness of a chromosome by a small amount, so that in time it squeezes its parents and other inferior chromosomes out of the population. By looping through this cycle hundreds of times, it's possible to evolve a neural network, or whatever one is trying to evolve, which performs quite well. For my PhD at the University of Brussels, I was evolving neural networks that gave time-dependent output signals. As far as I know, that was the first time that anyone had done such a thing. Previously, a few people had applied GAs to neural network evolution, but the applications were static. That is, the signals being extracted did not change with time. This struck me as being unnecessarily restrictive. The GA should be able to handle time-dependent outputs. Once I had this insight, I started to evolve a neural net that made some stick legs walk. It worked. It required a few tricks to get it to evolve, but it did work. That initial discovery that it was possible to evolve neural network dynamics, as distinct from statics, opened up a whole new world for me and created a new research branch called evolutionary neural systems. I began to wonder what I would do next. The thought occurred to me that if I could evolve one behavior with one neural net, I could evolve a different behavior with a second neural net, that is, one with a different set of weights. The weight set determines the dynamics of the output signals. I became more ambitious. Instead of playing with simple stick legs confined to a 2D plane, I would evolve behaviors for a 3D simulated quadruped creature that I called Lizzie. If I could evolve one behavior successfully, then I could evolve a whole library of behaviors with one neural net per behavior. I could probably then switch behaviors by having Lizzie at first walk and then turn. To achieve a smooth behavioral transition, all that was necessary was to switch off the inputs to the walk straight behavior generating network, or module as I started calling them, and input the outputs of the walk module to the turn module. Simulation experiments showed that the motion transition was smooth. Great! I now knew I could get a quadruped creature like Lizzie to display a whole library of behaviors. The question arose as to when one would want to switch behaviors. Perhaps such decisions might arise from stimuli coming from the environment. I started to see if I could evolve detector modules, for example, signal strength detectors, frequency detectors, signal strength difference detectors, etc. Yes, it was possible. The next logical step was to attempt to evolve decision type modules, for example, of the type, if the strength of the first input signal is greater than S1 and the strength of the second input signal is less than S2, then switch on action AN. That is, a stimulus signal would be sent to the module that executes action AN. in other words, the nth action. Putting all these three kinds of modules together, that is, behavior generating or behavioral modules, detector modules, and decision modules, it seemed to me that it would be possible to start making artificial nervous systems. If there were a lot of such modules, then I thought it would be fair to call such a collection an artificial brain. It was at this stage that I started to become very ambitious. I began to see myself as the future pioneer of artificial brains, as Mr. Brain Builder. But there were problems. The computer I was using in the late 80s and early 90s was hopelessly slow for the task I had in mind. By the time I was playing with a dozen evolved modules, the simulation speed of Lizzie on the computer screen was becoming noticeably slow. Every time I added another module's weights, the simulation speed slowed further. It became obvious to me that this was not the way to go. I had to get around how to get around this problem, ? By this stage I had finished my PhD and was now postdocing in Japan in 1992. In the summer of that year I was in the US talking with an electronic engineer acquaintance of mine at one of the universities that I am associated with, namely George Mason University in Virginia. I was asking this acquaintance how it might be possible to use electronics to speed up the evolution of my neural net modules. After about an hour's discussion, he mentioned something called an FPGA, a Field Programmable Gate Array. Not being an electronic engineer, I'd never heard of such a thing. "What's an FPGA?" I asked. He told me that it was a special kind of chip that was programmable. That is, one could send in a bit string that would instruct the chip how to wire itself up, or configure itself, to use the technical term. I suddenly got very excited. A vision flashed before my eyes. Since I had spent the past few years using GAs to evolve neural nets, my immediate inclination was to imagine the configuring bit string as a GA chromosome. So the idea that it might be possible to evolve hardware directly in the chip suddenly looked plausible. I began to grill my acquaintance. "Can the configuring bit string be sent in an unlimited number of times?" He thought for a moment and replied that if the chip were based on RAM, RAM, that is, computer memory, then like ordinary RAM in any computer, the programmable chip could be reprogrammed as often as one likes. I felt overjoyed. It meant that it might be possible to send in random bit strings that would configure or wire up the programmable chip in a random way, generating a complex random circuit. If there was another circuit programmed by a human being to measure the performance of the randomly programmed chip, then it might be possible to perform a GA directly in hardware at hardware speeds. I was so excited by this vision that as soon as I got back to my Japanese research group, I gave a seminar on my idea and launched the research field of evolvable hardware. I wrote papers on this idea, preached it to colleagues, gave talks on it at conferences, etc. The research field of evolvable hardware, or just EH, is now an established research field with its own conferences every year or so in the US, Europe and Japan, plus its own academic journal. I feel I am the father of this field and use its basic ideas in my daily work. The following year, 1993, I moved to a research lab in Kyoto, Japan, where I began working on building an artificial brain. I was convinced, after my discovery of the possibility of evolvable hardware, that I'd found a tool that would make the building of an artificial brain practical. I started writing papers announcing that I intended to build an artificial brain with 1 billion artificial neurons by the year 2001. In 1993, to make such an announcement invited disbelief, because at the time, most neural net researchers were dealing with tens to hundreds of neurons, as I had been in earlier years. To hear someone suddenly announce that he was going to use 1 billion sounded ludicrous. I was laughed at, ridiculed. But I was convinced then that my vision was sound. If one could build a special kind of computer based on the principles of evolvable hardware, then its electronic evolution speeds would make brain building practical. I did the math and reasoned that 1 billion neuron artificial brain by 2001 would be just about doable. I had a contract with my Japanese lab for 7 to 8 years, so I thought I had the time to be ambitious. My first task was to choose some kind of medium in which to grow and evolve neural nets. I chose to use Cellular Automata, CA. Each cell of a two-dimensional cellular automata can be likened to a square on a chessboard, but with two differences. One is that the chessboard has an unlimited number of squares. The other is that the squares are not confined to be only black or white, but can be any of a finite set of colours. Each square can change its colour into any other of the set only at the tick of a clock. The colour that a particular square changes into depends on its current colour and the colours of its four immediate touching neighbour squares. For example, if the north square is red, the east square is yellow, the south square is blue, the west square is green, and the central square in question is brown, then at the next clock tick, the central square changes its colour to purple. By appropriately choosing thousands of such rules, it was possible for me to make these cellular automata cells behave like a neural network that grows and evolves. For example, I could grow pathways 3 cells wide, in which I would send growth cells that moved down the middle of the path. When a growth signal hit the end of the growing path, it would make the path extend, turn left, turn right, split, etc., depending on the colour of the growth signal. By mutating the sequence of these growth signals that were sent down the middle of the CA pathways, I was able to evolve a CA, cellular automata, based neural net. This process occurred in 2 phases. The first was the growth phase. After a few hundred clock ticks, the growth would saturate. No more 3D cell-wide CA trails or paths could be grown. These trails were the axons and dendrites of the neural net. Once the growth phase was completed, that is, the growth instruction cells had cleared themselves from the network, the grown neural net could then be used for the subsequent signaling phase. Input signals could be applied, which would propagate over the network. These signals behave like the signals in the neural networks that I had evolved in earlier years. They could be extracted at output points and used to control processes whose fitnesses or performance quality could be measured. The fitness of the performance became the fitness of the network, which in turn was grown from a sequence of growth instructions, that is, a random string of 6 different integers, whole numbers. What I had done was marry neural nets with cellular automata. This had not been done before, as far as I know. The reason for doing this was that I thought CAs would be a suitable medium in which to have billions of CA cells, more than enough for a billion neurons. It seemed to me to be practical. The workstations, that is computers a bit more powerful than PCs, that's personal computers, of the time would have a gigabyte, a billion bytes of RAM memory in them. RAM is cheap, so since I could store the state or colour of one cellular automata cell in a single byte, 8 bits of RAM, and my workstation could have a gigabyte of RAM, that would allow me to store the colours of a billion CA cells. A billion! That's a lot. More than enough in which to put an artificial brain with a huge number of neurons. Space would not be a problem. The technology of the time would allow it. It would be practical. It took me about a year to write all the rules. North, east, south, west, centre type rules. To show that a 2D version of a CA-based neural net would work, that it would evolve. I had to hand code with software productivity tools to help me, about 11,000 such rules to get it to work, but work it did. I successfully evolved oscillator circuits, signal strength detection circuits, line motion detector circuits, etc. It was time to move on to a 3D version that would have quite a different topology. In 2D, circuits have to collide. They cannot go past each other, whereas in 3D, CA trails can pass each other using the third dimension. The dynamics and evolvability of 3D circuits would be much richer than the 2D case. I got the 3D version to work, but only after another 2 years and roughly 60,000 rules. By this stage, I was feeling quite miserable in Japan. My immediate group boss had a policy of having only one person per project, which made me terribly lonely and intellectually sterile. I had no one to really talk with. After exerting some pressure, I finally got a young German Master of Science level student to help me for the year 1996. I explained to him that the 3D version was pretty well finished and that I was becoming increasingly disillusioned with the particular CA model that I had been using. I explained to him my dream of growing and evolving CA-based neural circuits directly in electronics at electronic speeds. I felt that together we would need to simplify the CA model so that it would be possible to fit it all into the electronics of the time, that is 1996. He listened to my list of desiderata, desired things, and then disappeared for 2 weeks. He returned with a new, much simplified neural net model that kept the essential